right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a roundtable on the effect that the pandemic has had on Indigenous housing and service providers. My name is Stephen Sutherland, and I am the manager for the Indigenous Caucus of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of this land. We recognize the long history and contributions of First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, and support their vision of living justly in harmony with one another and in all our relations. We are thankful to serve our communities on this land and in this way. Today's webinar has been sponsored by BC Housing. The Indigenous Caucus is thankful for their continued support of the caucus and hopes that we can all meet together in 2021 in St. John's for Caucus Day. Our speakers today are Margaret Foe, CEO of Aboriginal Housing Management Association, the senior management team of Vancouver Native Housing Society, Robert Byers, CEO of Namrand Housing, Justin Marchand, Executive Director of Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services, and Andrew Harvey, Director of Social Supports and Interventions for First Light St. John's Friendship Centre in Newfoundland and Labrador. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. You will notice that everyone is muted. If you could please stay that way for the duration of the webinar, that would be great. You will see a space to ask questions. If you could enter your questions there, we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end of the speakers. If we do run out of time, we'll compile answers to your questions and share them accordingly. Now, with no further ado, I would like to introduce Rod Hill, Director of Indigenous Asset Management for BC Housing. Rod, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Son, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from unceded Coast Salish territory, and more specifically, the traditional territories of Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo First Nations. I raise my hands to their elders and the community and their leadership for the privilege and honor of being here today. I'm especially grateful for this panel today, in that each person here I've got, I can tell a story about. If we haven't actually met in person, I know your organization or know the communities that you service. For you, Andrew, being in St. John's, I spent a lot of time at St. John's in my earlier days. Went to elementary school at St. Mary's Elementary, which is just up the road from where you are. And then a friend of mine lived on the corner of that apartment at the corner of Waterford Bridge Road and what's the other street there? But that unique green building, I think it still is. Friends of mine lived there while in university and spent a lot of time there with them. Justin, I spent some great time with your colleagues when they came to Victoria. They visited our offices for a little while and spent some time with them. So I'm very familiar with the work that you do, and it's really quite amazing. Robert, you may not know this, but I spent 2 years in the Black Lake, Stony Rapids area. So many of the folks that you probably service in your communities and the work that you do is probably directly related to people that I had the opportunity to work with and be good colleagues with. Margaret, we've had some great times to hang out together, and I really appreciate all the work that AHMA and your team does, and just a fantastic resource and a great collaborative relationship between your team and my team in particular, but a great group of folks that do amazing work. And last but not least, Dave Eddy. I have a great story about Dave, in that I was working one time at this place, and we had a colleague named Michael, and one of my really close colleagues came by one time, and she said, I had this unbelievable, I met Michael's dad the other day, and he said, apple didn't fall far from the tree. I mean, here's Mike. He's this really charismatic, dynamic, amazing young man. He's got really empathetic towards Indigenous people, really committed to the cause, really just a wonderful person to work with, a wonderful colleague. And it turns out that we were talking about Dave, and had a chance to since meet Dave, and I can attest that all the good stuff that Michael has done is only a replication from the work that Dave has done. The apple certainly didn't fall far from the tree there, and that's a good thing for Indigenous peoples. So Uh, Great to have to be able to provide some opening comments with this panel in particular, and to think of all the great work that you all do. And you know, I might be Mi'kmaq from the East Coast, but we learn a lot from each other. And one of the things that I've learned from our Coast Salish friends is a unique way to honor people, and that is to raise your hands for them. And I raise my hands to each one of you for the work that you do, and I'm looking forward to benefiting from you sharing your knowledge here today. And thank each person that's taken the time to attend. I'm sure this is going to be beneficial to you in the activities that you do. I've been asked to also provide some comments about some of the things that BC Housing has done in response to our COVID-19 pandemic. Um, I've got a couple of topics, and I hope I don't take too much time, because really, you know, we should spend some time mostly with the folks that are on the panel here. But first, I'd like to kind of point out that you know, on April 25th, Minister Farnworth, through the Emergency Program Act, asked for the decampment of three facilities and three encampments in Victoria and Vancouver. And in particular, the one, you know, we were able to have 605 people relocated to facilities in a very short period of time. It was really a monumental effort, and it was really, you know, in terms of best practice, the one that was done with Oppenheimer Park in particular was really just an amazing work of collaboration with our First Nation partners, with organizations that were deeply connected to the issues and the surrounding supports that were necessary to support people. In the Oppenheimer camp, there were 261 people. Of that, 122 people were Indigenous. We were able to have everyone move from that location into housing that was, it was hotel accommodations. Luma Housing, which is an Indigenous housing provider, provided a lot of the supports and cultural supports for the people that were relocated. Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society was there every day. And then we had a lot of support from the three First Nations that encompass the Vancouver area. Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh had elders there every morning for ceremony to assist in that process. At the close, I was one of the guests invited to the closing ceremony, where each of the elders had a chance to speak. And there was a water ceremony to cleanse the area and to prepare it for its next cycle as a resource to the community. So that decampment was supported through some of the temporary accommodations that were established. So when COVID-19 first came about, our real estate team really kicked into high gear and found 100 sites with 3,000 spaces for accommodation for temporary accommodations, be it to address issues of homelessness or women and children fleeing violence, and providing sleeping pods and so forth in some of the emergency shelter locations. A monumental effort by our real estate team to secure those locations, working with municipalities, hotel providers, community supports, not-for-profit societies to be able to support memberships or people through all those processes. We were asked as BC Housing to establish a BC Temporary Rental Supplement Program, the TRS as it's called. That program was designed to support people's rent if they've lost employment as a result of what's happened, if they've lost their jobs as a result of COVID. So the program was provided for $300 for people with no dependents and $500 if you had dependents, to be put towards your rent in the event that you'd lost your job and unable to pay for it. With that, that program was initially established for April through June, but has since been extended to July and August. There's been 93,000 applications to that program, of which there's been 200,000 payments to date and counting. Along with that was a freeze of eviction notices and evictions. So there's been a number of things that have been done in association with the TRS program. One that I was heavily involved with and spent a great deal of time kind of supporting was an initiative to make sure that we had enough PPE and supplies for all of our partners through this process. And if you recall back, I know it feels like a lifetime ago now, but back in March when the pandemic first reared its head, trying to find a mask was a challenge. And trying to make sure that people had the equipment that they needed to operate their facility safely was a tremendous challenge. And trying to find that materials and supplies was really something else. There was one time in particular that I stood outside a supplies office for a half hour on the phone with people to see what I can kind of wrangle out of their clutches, and I was able to secure, I think it was 10 boxes of gloves, and we considered that a monumental win. You know, that we were all kind of, our entire team was hands on deck to support that. But we were able to secure supplies to get everyone through that. We've distributed 450,000 supplies across the province. They've been shipped so far. And we've also been able to establish a cache of supplies for a potential second wave here in the fall. We also, our team also was called on to find ways to support people to provide meals in the Vancouver area, food. We noted that there was potential for food supply issues in the province. So we sourced out locations where food can be delivered same day and then distributed in the downtown east side. And we still are, I think we still are, at least it was at one point, a fairly substantial amount of work. And it was, I think we're still delivering 1,000 meals per week into the downtown east side. And of course, the final thing with that is that we all had to learn how to do cleaning. You know, if someone had COVID, how do you clean the room? So we've established contracts with deep cleaners across the province to be able to go in and clean after someone has been tested positive for COVID, and if they're in any of our facilities, to make sure that those deep cleanings occurred. All this stuff was, you know, all these activities were things that we weren't subject matter experts in beforehand, but we had to figure our way through it and to go through all that stuff. We also provided a COVID-19 operations manual that was distributed to all of our partners across the province. It's still available on our website if you are interested in seeing it. I've been able to provide it to our First Nation partners to assist them with through the process. There's been a lot of questions from a lot of people about, you know, what constitutes best practice and how do we make sure that we keep our membership safe, and they've benefited from that as well. Final thing I'll note is that we worked with the BC Not-for-Profit Housing Association to provide a housing job match for people that were seeking employment at this time. That's just a small list of the things, but it also is really, I think it's really important to point out that that all this is done in collaboration with our partners from across the province, and that really our job in support of their work is really what we're trying to do, and to provide that supports for everybody. And really the heroes at the end of the day are the people that are providing the frontline service. We're here as a resource for people. So with that, Sean, I'll turn it back to you, and look forward to hearing from the panel. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Rod, for joining us. I'm now going to pass everything over to Margaret, who will be presenting on what AHMA has done during the pandemic.
Share a screen on the PPP as well. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick mic check for the people I can see. Can you guys actually hear me? Thank you. Okay, so in the language of my ancestors, Ni'it, hello everyone. My name is Margaret Foe and I'm the CEO for the Aboriginal Housing Management Association here in British Columbia. I want to raise my hands, as Rod had indicated, that is something we do here on the Coast Salish territory. Raise my hands to CHRA for coordinating this and welcome us to this panel. I also would like to acknowledge some of the good words that Rod had said earlier about the partnership and work that we've done. Most certainly here in BC, again, we're fortunate to have the partners that we have, not only with the government of BC, but with BC Housing. And COVID was a fantastic opportunity to demonstrate our willingness to work together. I'm just going to go over a quick highlight for everyone about who we are and what we've been doing. So if we can move to the next slide, Steve. So for those of you that don't know us, I'm not going to read this verbatim for you, but our organization has been on the ground for nearly 26 years now. We're a grassroots organization and the first of its kind here in Canada. If you can go on to the next slide, Steve. We have 41 members currently under our purview across the province of BC. We deliver over $40 million in subsidy to these 41 providers, and they are not only housing providers, they are also support workers as well, who are delivering services such as homelessness, outreach, transitions, and shelters. And it's very important that we acknowledge those distinctions, because most of us that work in the urban native housing sector are used to a certain kind of budgeting and staffing structure that doesn't exist necessarily, especially for some of our most vulnerable population and the programs that serve them. So our providers are largely urban native housing providers, but also constitute an evolving population of support providers that do services beyond the bricks and mortar of housing. And currently we're serving about 5,000 Indigenous families here in BC, which is looking to expand as the last round of IHF in 2018 saw a number of programs come to ground, including new housing providers. So those are all still in the works, and our portfolio will continue to grow. So next slide. So one of the things that's abundantly clear in response to the COVID-19 is that the disparities that exist for Indigenous peoples, and I'm sure my colleagues, I see we have representatives from Saskatchewan and Ontario, Robert and Justin, and I saw that we have Andrew from even further east. You guys will all agree that if anything, COVID-19 has demonstrated that the disparities between Indigenous peoples or our most vulnerable populations has actually only been highlighted and exacerbated as a consequence of COVID-19. And that's on all spectrum of issues that were affected by COVID-19, shutting down things like shelters, shutting down safe injection sites. We saw it as well around the whole incarceration issue. And on all of those, we know youth aging out of care, youth in care, women fleeing domestic violence, the missing and murdered Indigenous women's group and inquiry. Those situations have all been exacerbated as a consequence of COVID, because a lot of the programs and the support mechanisms that were in place to support them became a challenge, became an even bigger challenge because of COVID. And so when we start to take a look at what COVID has done with regards to Indigenous peoples, it really highlights our need to be that voice about housing being the panacea for not only for COVID, but for all of those areas of housing that Indigenous people are on the front line doing right now. Next slide. Some of the particular things will be similar to what Rod had talked about, because we worked in very close partnership with the province of BC through BC Housing, as well as through BC Nonprofit Housing Association. We created our own AHMA COVID-19 resource page that's on our website, currently available. One of the things that we did as well, and it was really amazing to see our board of directors step up and take on that leadership response. They freed up $1.8 million in the very early days of COVID-19. I'm thinking within a week of March 12th, we already had the board resolution to free up $1.8 million of restricted funds for our operational team to be more responsive to our providers, in terms that we knew right away that we were going to have a run on essential supplies And one of the first things that came out of our COVID consultation with our members was around the issue of staffing. We found that where some of our programs didn't have the luxury or the convenience of being able to send everybody to work from home, they actually had to go into the front lines and service people that couldn't self-isolate, that didn't have access to quarantine measures, and couldn't even meet some of the basic needs like hand sanitizer, or a face mask. And so they were at risk. And so the first ask that actually came across our desk was staff supplementation for emergency pay, for additional staff so that they could actually get to the clientele that needed the support services, and for security measures, especially for our vulnerable population, like our shelters and transitions, where we needed to control the guest access in and out, so that we could try to prevent the spread of COVID to those vulnerable populations. So the board of directors freeing up that $1.8 million allowed us as an organization and my staff to breathe a little bit easier, knowing we could be responsive to our community members. BC stepped up, fairly quickly in terms of setting guidelines and processes and protocols that were very supportive of not just the Indigenous housing sector, but the housing sector at large, around things like stay of evictions, rental adjustments, rental arrears agreements. One of our asks to the province was actually additional rent supplement dollars to support our providers, because we knew that most of our employed tenants work in some of the most vulnerable employment sectors. And so restaurants laid off a lot of employees, gas stations laid off a lot of employees, sector services like sanitation, garbage pickup, pretty much everywhere low income employed people were working, lost their jobs or were laid off. And so we knew that rent was going to be a challenge. We, in our $1.8 million submission to the province of BC, did include requests for rent subsidy for our providers, but were declined that because there were so many other things. Like you guys, I'm sure, were confused. We got federal initiatives, we got provincial initiatives, we got nonprofit initiatives, we got municipal initiatives, and we got all these criteria that were set up, and nobody knew who was going to qualify for rent supplements, who was going to qualify for nonprofit supplementation. So we've been working through that, and like Rod said, BC Housing had to make things up as they went along. AHMA had to make things up. I'm sure we're all in the same boat. Nobody expected our first emergency response to be a pandemic. I think we were all getting ready for the massive earthquake or tornadoes or fires. Those things we kind of could predict, but nobody really was ready for this to be a pandemic that has now stretched what we all thought was going to be 2 weeks of self-isolation and we'll go back to our daily lives. Nobody thought we were going to sit here in mid-July. So we've all done the best we can. We're grateful to our partnership with BC Nonprofit Housing Association. We held 4 webinars in partnership with BCMPHA and BC Housing to try to make sure we were listening to our community about what was happening on the ground as things evolved. And, I think by and large, we've done a great job of that. We just concluded regional sessions and consultation with our providers over the last couple of weeks. And if anything, some gaps were highlighted, and I'll speak to that a little bit later, but most certainly there was a lot of recognition and appreciation to the response by AHMA, by BC Nonprofit, and by BC Housing in terms of trying to do the best we can for our providers. So next slide. So I've already talked about this. We actually have spent 1.6 million of the initial estimated 1.8 million dollars in COVID. We are, in this slide, you'll see we talked about $81,000 in PPE. The bulk of those asks surround masks, and we're going to see now as we start to see COVID climb again here in BC, our numbers were down into single digits, and we went days without deaths, days without new outbreaks. We've now started to see those numbers change with the digits going back up into the double digits. We have a couple of hot spots that have occurred over the July long weekend, and we are being encouraged to reconsider our social bubbles and starting to limit those again to try to bend that curve, because the curve is now starting to go the wrong way. So the big ask that we're seeing is the consumption of masks, gloves, and sanitizers. So, and again, I'll speak a little bit about that later, but it's been nice to have the kind of support we've had with the province of BC and BC Nonprofit to meet those needs. Next slide, please. So again, you know, on an operational level, we've been able to maintain ongoing renovation projects. One of the evolving partnerships we've had, and a huge thank you to Rod as an advocate within BC Housing to work with our asset strategies team around ensuring that we are being responsive to our providers around the maintenance and the renovation and the reinvestment in our current stock has been fantastic. And that budget for asset strategies has only grown. And so when COVID hit, there was this big crisis about how do we ensure that the essential safety requirements of our providers in terms of their renovations are ongoing. And I think that we've done a great job in that as well, along with emergency technical support in terms of unforeseen situations such as break-ins, which certainly has been on the rise. And business continuity planning for our organizations continues to be an ongoing effort that we're working on. Next slide, please. So one of the emerging situations, and I'm sure again, Justin and Robert, you know, you're seeing this across the country as well, the rise in opioid crises. Here in British Columbia alone, we've seen 89 suspected drug toxicity deaths from January to May, which is a 93% increase since last year. And we know through the First Nations Health Authority that that is actually even larger now as we speak. Next slide, please. What we're seeing again is the impact, the lingering impact of COVID-19 is the inability of those outreach programs and culturally safe harm reduction strategies have either been suspended or limited, you know, and not because the province is rolling back dollars necessarily, but it does speak to the whole human resource challenge that COVID-19 has presented. And we ourselves at AHMA are facing that, where we get staff that have underlying health conditions. And even though BC has moved into phase 3, we have staff that are unprepared to even risk coming into the office because they're afraid of their risk exposure, or they've got elderly parents that they are in care of and responsible for and don't want to risk that exposure getting on a bus, going to a coffee shop to get a lunch, or even just taking that elevator to get into our office poses a great risk to them. And so what we're seeing on the addiction front is staffing crises as well. That inability to maintain and recruit and retain the skilled professionals to provide the culturally safe harm reduction strategies for our urban Indigenous peoples. So it's an ongoing challenge for sure, and certainly one of the biggest issues that has arisen in consequence of the opioid, the COVID crisis. Next slide. So moving on, and probably the biggest part of my conversation is around the post-pandemic and world challenges ahead. I did have the privilege, and I am sitting on a number of panels coming up over the next few weeks. One is a panel with Australia and the challenges that they're facing. You know, it's interesting to find out that we actually are more alike than we think with other countries that have gone through colonization and are having to battle for Indigenous, not just housing, but Indigenous community challenges in general. So the three biggest areas that have come to the forefront for us are political challenges, dealing with government, non-Indigenous influence, the need for non-Indigenous communities to understand, self-educate, and become an advocate for us. And then this whole ongoing divided Indigenous relations, which is a consequence of constitutional discrimination. And I'll speak to that in a moment. Next slide, please. So from a political challenge, you know, one of the biggest things that we're seeing is, even though, and I had this conversation with Rod's boss, Shane Ramsey, yesterday, you know, as an Indigenous organization here in Canada and in particular in British Columbia, we see that we work in a great environment. We have a government that's wanting to support us. We have an entity like BC Housing that wants to support for Indigenous, by Indigenous through AHMA. But while there are good people, the system itself is structured to fail to include Indigenous people and Indigenous leaders at the decision-making table. And so we see this even with the best of intentions. You know, there are great people in BC Housing that make an effort and have gone out of their way, but there's still systemic structures that make it easier to exclude AHMA when it comes to decision making around responses and around solutions. A fine example will be the rush from BC Housing to acquire hotels to help the homeless populations have that safe place to isolate and quarantine. There were a number of great solutions and they were essential, but there were some communities where the largest population is urban Indigenous people, and not once was there an attempt to consult with urban Indigenous leaders in those regions to make sure that those hotels were actually being led by Indigenous entities so that the community that they were serving had that cultural respect and inclusion that comes from having an Indigenous-led organization assisting along that process. And Shane is the first to say, yep, could we have done that? Yes. Did we have the time? Not necessarily. We all know government typically gets in a top-down process where the minister says, we freed up this money, go make this happen. Everybody rushes to make it happen. What we fight for and what we argue is that time cannot be an excuse. We're either your partner or we're not your partner. Being your partner means when you get that word that you've got millions of dollars to go buy hotels, your first phone call should be to AHMA so that we can say, yes, I've just finished my regional consultations and I can tell you that Comox and Campbell River have an Indigenous organization there ready to be of service in assisting you through those hotel acquisitions and the placement of Indigenous people into those hotels. I'm not saying that they did that on purpose, they forgot us on purpose. It's just a pattern of behavior that needs to be broken and needs to be challenged. And it's not about saying that those people did it purposefully. We have great people. We just need to argue to change the system and the structure to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have particular challenges and needs that are best met by Indigenous organizations. Here in BC, we have the UNDRIP legislation that was tabled and passed. And you know, even some of the founding organizers that created it regret that it's called DRIPA. So when we reference that here in BC, they reference the DRIPA legislation. You know, at the end of the day, it's a fantastic step, and it's a good step forward in demonstrating the desire towards reconciliation, but it lacks substance. It lacks the meat and potatoes of reconciliation that says, DRIPA says that we are here to support Indigenous peoples, full stop. But what we're finding is that imbalance in government's capacity to understand the three distinction-based groups, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, don't speak for the vast majority of urban Indigenous populations. And when the government fails to acknowledge the value of urban Indigenous leadership, we are further marginalizing the 40 to 60 to sometimes 80% of Indigenous peoples who are not captured in those three distinction-based group negotiations. And so we argue with government that they can't be using the system of colonization to hide behind that system of colonization to further marginalize urban Indigenous people. It's an ongoing battle. I'm having a conversation with the minister tomorrow. I intend to ask, how do we create relationship agreements that don't marginalize urban Indigenous people any further than they already have been as a consequence of systemic racism? Next slide. The other factor that we're realizing, and this really comes out of the BIPOC movement, the whole Black, Indigenous, people of color, you know, after George Floyd's death and the protests that happened in the United States, is the realization that by and large, community likes to live in their little bubble of ignorance, which is to say, systemic racism happened 150 years ago, get over it. Residential schools have been closed for 50 years, 100 years, get over it. You know, why are you guys still unemployed? Why are you guys still going to prison more than others? Why are you guys, you know, addicted? Why are your children in care? Why are your elders dying on the street? Blah, blah, blah. All of that was 100 years ago. The reality is there is a huge gap in awareness and education and conversation that needs to occur so that non-Indigenous community understands the challenge. We're not going to play the victim. We don't have to be the victim in this scenario. We need to be partners in advocating the systemic change that needs to occur. We're eternally grateful that we've had the partnership of the United Nations through Leilani Farah, and hopefully the new special rapporteur will get back to us on their objectives moving forward. Of course, Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and BC Nonprofit have been fantastic advocates. BC Housing has been fantastic advocates, but there's more we can do, and we need to start to be purposeful in our conversation about what it means to be for Indigenous, by Indigenous, in our solutions and in our activities. Next slide. And then, of course, you know, the final issue here is the divided Indigenous relations. Government loves it when they say, well, we don't know what to do with you, urban Indigenous. Go back and speak to your First Nations and get their approval, or get them, form a partnership with them. Well, the reality is there are so many urban Indigenous peoples that cannot go back to home. You know, I love it when people say, go back to where you came from, go back to your reserve. Well, I'm a 60 scoop child. I was adopted out at birth. I was never, ever connected to my community. And I have so many barriers to being connected to my community. My home is in the urban environment. The needs of myself, my community, and many of our clients that are served by our urban Indigenous leaders will tell you that they can't go back. They're not getting the support from the reserve systems. They're not getting support from Métis Canada because there are systemic barriers to doing that. And so we need to be strong in our argument with government that they can't use the system of colonization, the system within our Constitution, to continue to divide and conquer us as Indigenous peoples. As I said, the theory behind UNDRIP and DRIPA here in BC is that Indigenous people have basic human rights, full stop. Not whether I live on a reserve or have a chief and council going to lobby for me. The people that have the rights are the Indigenous peoples. And we as urban Indigenous leaders have the right to speak about that and to voice the needs of our urban Indigenous peoples because we have that expertise. And then, of course, there's always the competitive process that happens with funding. And it does get to be a bit of a threat. You know, here in BC with the Housing Infrastructure Council BC coming to ground, there's this, you know, perceived, I don't even believe it's real. There's this perceived perception that if BC Housing helps HIC, Housing Infrastructure Council, they're taking money away from the urban Indigenous. So we need to get beyond all of those perceptions and start having a conversation about we're not creating a hierarchy of pain. We're actually trying to meet the needs of our people regardless of where they're at. And I know the minister has said that. I think it's about being able to put meat and potatoes around that to demonstrate that we are not dividing and conquering. We are doing this to support our Indigenous people regardless of where they're located. So at the end of it all, I always fall back to CHRA's standing document, the for Indigenous, by Indigenous. The reality is nothing should happen about us without us at that table. And I'm talking about the decision-making tables, and that's what we continue to lobby and fight for. So thank you, everyone. Toyak Sim, appreciate you giving me the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Margaret. That was super informative, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Up next is the Vancouver Native Housing Society senior team led by Dave. Dave, I'm going to give you ability to present there now. So you should be able to share your screen as needed. And Dave, just as a heads up, you are still muted there as well.
Okay, we're ready to go. Sorry about the echo. Hello, everyone from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh here in Vancouver, British Columbia. My name's Dave Eddy, and I'm the CEO of Vancouver Native Housing Society. As many of you know, Margaret Foe is a hard act to follow, as she is so articulate, passionate, and has that storytelling gig down to a science. So if you're expecting similar from me, sorry, you're out of luck. And thanks, Steve, for the scheduling. Anyhow, I'm fortunate to have my senior management staff here with me to back me up and do most of the work. I'm very proud of what they have and continue to accomplish during these troubled times, and I know you will be pleased and enlightened with their firsthand contribution of their working experiences during the pandemic. So without further ado, I will invite our first speaker, Margaret Go, to begin our presentation.
Good day, everyone. My name is Margaret Go. I am the Director of Operations and Quality Improvement at Vancouver Native Housing Society. I'm here to talk about the impact of COVID on our organization as a whole and how it impacted our tenants. I will also share the solutions our organization provided on an executive level and the steps taken to mitigate the impact of COVID on our tenants. Later on, my colleagues will tackle the challenges encountered and resolutions done in their respective departments. At the start of the pandemic, one of the challenges we encountered was limited access to testing. We had a couple of staff members who exhibited COVID symptoms and were only able to get tested on the 10th day of illness after our CEO made some calls and twisted a few arms. Staffing posed a challenge as several frontline workers went on EI, COVID leave, or altogether resigned either due to fear of contracting the virus or had to stay home to take care of family members. Due to the change in the way we work, additional organizational costs were incurred. The pandemic coincided with our year-end audit and put the strain on our bean counters. We had to move away from the way we handled maintenance issues. As COVID forced us to shut down our workplace, our IT department was put to task to handle this new dynamic of working from home. As I'm sure all of our partners experienced, we witnessed unprecedented shortage of COVID supplies like PPEs and cleaning materials. How it impacted our tenants. As with a lot of folks who lost their jobs or got laid off, our tenants were not spared. We received numerous calls and emails from tenants that they lost their jobs and will not be able to pay rent. We also had seniors on pension who did not experience a reduction of income, but advises they were not able to pay rent. Some tenants reach out to let us know that due to the reduction or loss of income, they don't have enough money to buy food. Some tenants, especially seniors, shared that they were afraid to venture out to do grocery shopping for fear of being exposed to the virus. Others who relied on free meals offered by, for instance, Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center or the Aboriginal Mother Center were unable to avail of this resource because the centers halted their services during the pandemic. Because we were restricted to provide only essential maintenance work in the suites, that is only if it is a fire, flood, life or death situation, it was a challenge to perform maintenance work. For example, some tenants' appliances needed repair, which could not be attended to in a timely manner. At the onset, there was a shortage of COVID supplies, which we were not able to provide the building staff to protect themselves and their surroundings. Due to the vulnerable population we house, we needed to restrict visitors from entering the buildings to protect our tenants' well-being. This decision was challenged by a few tenants who were adamant that their quote-unquote guests, which may include unregistered occupants, be allowed into the building. Lawlessness has never been so rampant in the downtown east side as experienced during this pandemic. The proliferation of drugs on the streets and break-ins have left our tenants more vulnerable than ever. With the turbulence and stress caused by the pandemic, some tenants resorted to alcohol and drugs. We've had our share of opioid overdoses, and we also had a couple of tenants who attempted self-harm. We have low end of market tenants who pay 90% of market rent who have given notices to move out due to the inability to pay the LEM rates. What we did to mitigate the negative impact. On the executive level, our society formed a COVID team that met 3 times a week to brainstorm on ways to mitigate the negative impact of COVID. In order to incentivize our workers to keep on working, we boosted their salaries and gave them COVID pay, what others call as hazard pay. We attended webinars to keep abreast of ever-changing information, and we collaborated with partners, funders, and sister societies to compare notes and learn from each other. On the operational level, what we did for our tenants, for tenants who experienced a reduction of loss of income, our team assisted them to recalculate their rent, directed them on how to apply for EI or CERB. We sent them rent letters to remind them they are still responsible to pay their rent. And information was disseminated to the tenants, informing them that the tenants who are on subsidized rent are not qualified for the BC tenant rent supplement. When the state of emergency was announced, VNH's staff worked tirelessly in the ensuing days to disseminate guidelines and educational materials to share about safety procedures. Some of these are social distancing posters, hand washing instructions. For the first time ever, the Happy Birthday song made it to the Billboard charts. We also shared self-assessment tools for tenants who are exhibiting COVID symptoms. We also shared tenant bulletins. Some of these are restricting visitors, and others are bulletins to help the tenants avail of resources. And these include information on CRB, EI, or other federal and provincial programs, food security, grocery deliveries, home support, overdose prevention, mental health support, Indigenous programs, senior services, among others. As mentioned earlier, one of our challenges was to keep our buildings and tenants safe. The pandemic led to an increase in street chaos and disorder. It was necessary to deploy security guards in some buildings to keep the residents safe and screen unauthorized people from entering the buildings. Some buildings needed 24/7 security, while others had 12-hour shift guards. Thanks to the funding of AHMA, we installed security cameras in one building badly in need of this equipment. Enhanced cleaning of touch points were rolled out to building staff to disinfect touch points. This was done 3 times a day on weekdays. A third-party cleaning company was contracted to disinfect during weekends. Laundry rooms were opened for longer hours to promote social distancing. Amenity rooms were closed to prevent tenants from congregating, and dining room in the seniors building was closed. Food was prepared and individually packed and delivered to the suites. So I will now pass on the torch to my colleague, Julie Wang.
Thanks, Margaret. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Wang. I am CFO at VNHS. I will focus on 3 areas to talk about how COVID-19 impacted finance team. The first impact of COVID was related to our year-end audit. Our fiscal year end is March 31st, 2020, which this year coincided almost exactly with the provincial declaration of emergency measures due to the pandemic. Consequently, our auditors, KPMG, developed a new system to carry out the audit. As a result, the finance team had to adopt the new system, which created a lot of extra work for finance department. The following extra steps had to be taken in order to have year-end audit done on time. We had to digitize all the evidence and backup. In order to do this, we have to stop the finance team working from home and bring them back to the office in the middle of April. We had to scan all the selected samples and backup to send to auditors. We had to virtually check inventory count and personnel file using Teams to meet the auditors' expectations. The second impact was on staff. The whole organization had staff challenges during COVID-19. In the last 2 weeks of March, we had total 18 staff leave. This included 1 finance team member. At the same time, auditors asked us many questions related to COVID-19, such as where did the fund related to COVID-19 come from, and where was the money allocated, and how were we planning to track the fund in yearly. The finance team decided to set up a new account, specifically track the money spent for the COVID-19. We had to provide them with a lot of actual report to evidently back up what we did. In order to have those actual work done in timely manner, we had to shuffle the team and delegated additional tasks to appropriate person. The third was to find the funding to cover all extra related COVID costs. AHMA funding. Since we realized that immediately our normal operating funding could not cover this outbreak, so we need to provide additional funding to departments such as operations, asset strategy, and IT. Fortunately, our provincial funder, AHMA, saw need and the gravity of the situation and responded immediately with tremendous financial and organization support. Take it from me, we do not normally celebrate the speed in which funders respond to financial requests, but in all issues related to the pandemic, we have nothing but praise for their actions. The other source funding, I would like Nancy to talk about it. She is our senior project manager.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Chu, Senior Project Manager at the VNHS. Now I'm speaking about the other sources of funding we were able to tap in. I believe supporting our frontline staff, helping our tenants, and serving the community are essential service for us as the senior management team during the COVID-19 pandemic. As my role of senior project manager is project-driven, my duties were immediately switched to respond to RFPs related to COVID-19. We applied to several funding calls from different sources, such as Reaching Home, Indigenous Service Canada, and the community agencies. As a result, we are able to obtain funding from those 3 sources. We are able to, with those funding, to fulfill various activities such as supplying a meal program, obtaining sufficient PPE supplies, and providing financial assistance for many of our tenants. The pandemic come at us fast and hard, not allowing a lot of time to plan, develop, and test strategies to help us get through it. As a result of this experience, one of the learnings we have come away with is that we need to be flexible, nimble, and ready to trust our instincts for creating a plan without planning. To paraphrase Peter Drucker, widely known as the founder of modern management, planning is the kiss of death of entrepreneurship. Now I'm passing to Trevor. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Trevor Broadhead and I'm the Director of Administration and Communications for UNHS. Food security became a major concern when COVID-19 hit, particularly during the first few months when everyone was told to stay home and self-isolate. It was especially challenging for our most vulnerable populations, seniors, people with physical and mental disabilities, and those struggling with addiction. So here's what we did. We established a tenant outreach program that was designed to connect with tenants by phone to make sure they had the supports in place to successfully navigate COVID-19. We soon learned that this was a very effective way to see who was struggling and who was coping through the pandemic. Our administrative assistant, Gina Louie, who is Indigenous herself, was assigned to reach out to all our tenants by phone to determine their needs. She was given 5 questions to ask each tenant to create efficiency and see what assistance was needed. Any information that she collected was passed on to the property manager to respond accordingly. Since the middle of April, we have achieved a 67% response rate in this program. One tenant said, "It was nice to hear from VNHS and hear that they were concerned for my needs and that they appreciated making the effort to contact them." Another program that we established was a partnership with Holway House to deliver meal delivery to our tenants. This partnership was geared towards serving our most vulnerable tenants in 4 of our supportive housing properties. And the turnaround time was phenomenal. It only took us about a week from the time we decided to launch the program to get meals delivered to the doors of the tenants. The meals were restaurant quality, and there was a variety of food available, including accommodations for those with dietary restrictions. Since the program began in April, we've served more than 14,000 meals to our tenants, and the demand continues to be high, even though the lockdown restrictions have largely been lifted. The ability of Holway House to respond as quickly and effectively as they did had a significant impact on our tenant community, and we want to thank them for being a wonderful partner, and to Jenny Conkin and their team for all their support. I'm going to pass it over to Patrick now to talk about IT.
Hello. In the IT world, the key points from working from home was to ensure laptops that AHMA kindly funded $40,000 towards purchasing were equipped with essential apps, these being Microsoft Suite, particularly Outlook, Excel, Word, PowerPoint. Another useful app being SRX Pro, our security camera system. This gives property managers and directors of operations access to view video footage of our buildings for operational purposes, whether that was for arbitration or the police or just mitigating issues. And there were some miscellaneous apps such as Adobe Acrobat Reader, browsers such as Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge for accessing Yardi and other sites. We also wanted to ensure laptops were able to connect to the VNHS network. This means setting up a VPN for secure, safe connection through the internet to the VNHS server, which in turn meant laptops needed to join the VNHS domain so that laptops could be authenticated and enable staff to access their files on the file server and the security cameras at the buildings. This in turn also meant that we needed to protect the VNHS network from the laptops should a staff member accidentally get a virus while searching the web. This meant installing virus protection, which we are currently using ESET. We also needed to ensure that IT had the ability to access staff laptops remotely. We managed this through a web-based program called Screen Connect. With this program, IT could take control of the laptop and relieve the staff member of most of the troubleshooting task. Major obstacles we encountered is what we learned was that there was some conflict between VPN and Screen Connect when run at the same time. We had major lag, but we managed through it. From an IT point of view, after this initial setup and a few weeks to adjust, it was mostly business as usual. As you know, IT never rests. I will now pass you to Robert Jordan, our Director of Assets.
Thanks, Patrick. Hello, everybody. As Patrick said, I'm Robert, Director of Asset Services with Vancouver Native Housing. At the start of this, we had to modify our scope of activity. And as you know, there were so many unknowns at the onset of the restrictions that we had to look around and see how BC Housing and other housing providers were responding to the pandemic. Staying consistent with the sector, Asset Services immediately discontinued responding to all non-emergency maintenance tasks. This means that we directed our focus entirely on tasks related to fire, flood, or security risks. VNHS takes an escalating approach to maintenance activity. Site staff will usually get the first crack at addressing maintenance requests, and if the work is beyond their capacity, it gets reassigned to our maintenance technicians or to outside vendors if it can't be done in-house. Under normal operations, one of the first things we ask would be if we have permission to enter. Now, even before knowing if we have permission to enter, we want to first know, is it safe to enter? We had to make some staffing reassignments. The nature of the maintenance technician's job means they're bouncing from one building to another, and this puts them at greater personal risk. Being in contact with all of the site staff and tenants from every building, but it also puts each site manager and tenants at risk, as the maintenance technician could potentially spread pathogens from one site to another. VNHS currently has 3 field workers that respond to maintenance requests anywhere in the portfolio. Due to the decreased demand for maintenance, we had to place a part-time field worker on temporary leave. This individual had already been working with restrictions, and due to decreased immune response, we agreed the safest place for that worker was to remain in the safety of their home. We kept our longest tenured field technician at head office on standby to respond to emergency tasks. Our newest field maintenance technician was designated to a high demand site where they focus on disinfecting touch points and any emergency maintenance and unit turnover prep at that site only. As additional precautions, in maintenance, even under normal operations, we're taught safety first. We didn't receive any pushback about the PPE requirement. Maintenance staff was more concerned if the PPE was adequate to keeping them safe. If possible, we asked that site staff would first look into the maintenance requests to determine if they were in fact emergencies, and ask questions to residents to make sure that nobody was experiencing COVID-like symptoms. We asked staff to try communicating through closed doors to avoid unnecessary face-to-face contact. If it was determined to be an emergency or had potential to lead to an emergency, and if the residents were not experiencing flu-like symptoms, we asked that residents maintain their distance from anybody entering their suite, leaving the suite, or staying in another room while the work is being done when possible. We asked staff to only enter if wearing a face mask and gloves, and to only address the emergency repairs while in the unit. We required staff to carry disinfectant spray to wipe down anything before and after contact. We also deal with procurement in my department, and our first step was to determine what supplies were at each site. We had limited emergency response supplies, so we didn't want to distribute to buildings that already had good inventory levels. We took into consideration factors like number of staff and tenant demographics. Some of our buildings are staffed 24 hours per day and offer support services. If the building housed seniors or other vulnerable populations, extra supplies were allocated. VNH staff, not usually involved in procurement, were reaching out to their connections and making personal trips to Costco, often multiple trips due to individual purchasing limits imposed by the stores. We significantly increased our regular orders with large vendors like AHMA, Planet Clean, and Swish, even though it meant back orders. We developed new vendor relationships. BC Housing and AHMA supported us with deliveries of PPE and disinfectant. All of our COVID-19 related purchases were kept separate by designated Yardi work orders and purchase orders, and new dedicated account code as provided by our finance department. what we learned from this is it's not good enough just to be stocked up and supplied for regular operations. We need to have months worth of personal protective equipment and disinfecting supplies. In closing, we're going to turn it back over to Dave for some final remarks.
Thanks, Robert. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try and make this fast. I know we have other speakers. So the final challenge is, that we will address in this morning's presentation has to do with the impacts that COVID has had on our two social enterprises, Squatch Eyes Lodge and Squatch Eyes Gallery, a boutique Indigenous art hotel and an Indigenous art gallery. As some of you may know from our presence at CHRA conferences in the last decade, the revenue generated from these two entities has been responsible for supporting 24 Indigenous artists in their personal and professional development on 3-year tenancies since 2012. Through these ventures, we have been able to generate approximately $1.5 million to support artists in residency over the last 8 years. Because the hotel and gallery are public-facing businesses, we were forced to shut them both down on March 19, 2020. We were able to reopen the gallery on June 1st, but the hotel remains closed. We expect losses this fiscal year to approach $500,000 from the projected $1.4 million we were predicting pre-COVID. Okay, with the onset of COVID and closing of the street-facing businesses, we realized the only other way to increase revenue, at least in the gallery, would be through our online portal. We also recognized that we did not have in-house expertise to carry this out, so we hired a social media summer student to launch our campaign. Our main revenue generation model at both entities has been through our ability to attract international hotel guests to Vancouver related to their interest in Northwest Coast art, culture, spirituality, and practice. With respect to the hotel, when it does reopen, we know it will be some time before international travel and tourism will be anywhere near what we have experienced pre-COVID, and we will need to mine other sources in order to stay afloat. That means focusing more on regional and local guests and members of the Vancouver and BC business community. Recognizing that much of our gallery sales were generated primarily by hotel guests and local traffic, the shutdown made us realize new strategies were needed to offset these losses. We quickly understood that one way to do this would be to create a much more robust online presence, utilizing not only online sales portal, but also platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. In 3 weeks since hiring our student, we have already seen an increase in sales volume and recognition of the gallery. The final item we will discuss today to lessen the impact of the pandemic on our social enterprise is the launch of a Kickstarter campaign. Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform for raising money from the public, which circumvents traditional avenues of investment. We know that key to the success of any crowdfunding effort is the telling and the selling of a good story. We believe our story is one that will strike a chord with many who are interested in and supportive of social justice, poverty reduction, creating opportunities for those marginalized, and the provision of safe, secure, affordable housing. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here today and hope you will all support us. Our plan is to launch our campaign in the next 10 days, and we hope everyone listening here will get involved. We will be offering rewards from our gallery at deeply discounted rates to those who participate, so please stay tuned and sign on once we go live. The Gratitude limited edition print you see on the right of the screen was made by Haida artist Eric Parnell, and it is one of the rewards we're offering. Information on the launch will be disseminated shortly. If you do not receive a personal invite to get involved, watch for information on the launch from agencies such as CHRA, AHMA, BCMPHA, Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and others. Also, feel free to email me directly if you haven't heard anything in the next 10 days. Thank you for hearing our story today. We hope you find the information we have provided to be of use to you and your organizations. Thank you.
Great, perfect. Thanks, Dave and team. Being cognizant of time, Justin, Robert, and Andrew, with a thumbs up, are you guys able to stay on past the 15 minutes from what we have? Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys. Okay, moving on. Robert, you're up.
Well, thank you for inviting me to sit on this panel, Stephen. So I'm the president and CEO of Namrand Housing Corporation, and Namrand is an Indigenous nonprofit housing provider in Regina, Saskatchewan. Our mission is to provide safe and affordable quality housing for Indigenous people and economic development opportunities here in Regina. So in 1977, our community determined a great need for affordable housing for Indigenous people, and supply was an issue. It was decided that we take care of our own. We now have about 250 homes and house somewhere around 800 Indigenous people. Now, we are vertically integrated. We have our own property management department that covers maintenance and construction for our properties as well as for others. As part of our social enterprise, we also own a mall, which houses our pharmacy as well. Namrand is the official Reaching Home community entity for Regina. We are one of 3 Indigenous entities in Canada that manage both the designated community and Indigenous homelessness funding streams. We are proud to be as involved with our community as we can. Now, the pandemic has thrown us a few curveballs. First, I want to talk a little bit about our business. So we were deemed essential and have stayed open throughout. We retrofitted our building with magnetic doors and plexiglass screens and so on. Our staff stagger their days to permit social distancing in our office, and we all wear PPE. I'm very proud of the way that our team has pulled together and risen to this pandemic challenge. We've taken advantage of the federal wage subsidy, and it's been a godsend. Our province had an eviction ban for tenants that were in rent arrears, but Namrand has been lucky enough to not be affected by it. We operate exclusively in Regina, and Regina is in Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan has an Indigenous homelessness problem. In 2018, point in time or pit counts of homeless population was done in Prince Albert, Saskatoon, and Regina. In Regina, 79% of the homeless people that were counted self-identified as Indigenous. In Saskatoon, it was 85%. And in Prince Albert, it was a whopping 92%. The next pit count has been delayed to 2021 with no actual date confirmed. More Indigenous homeless people are becoming visible now and showing up in the system. Those who depended on friends to let them stay the night while they lived day by day no longer have anywhere to turn while everyone self-isolates. Shelters should be the highest priority for the homeless population. They are representatives of a public health crisis. Why are Indigenous homeless people not sleeping in shelters? Why are so many of them on the streets of Regina or the streets of Toronto for that matter? I think some of the reasons. In Saskatchewan, our shelters are closed because of COVID-19. So are many of the services that used to be available for mental health and recovery. Our people face racism, but so do others. And many of our people struggle with mental health and dependency issues. The ensuing chaos makes it unlikely that they will be organized enough to get a bed. And that is true of many non-Indigenous homeless people as well. Where our people are sadly unique is that we have grown up with the unimaginable damage that our parents and grandparents endured in residential schools. We grew up and share their pain. The images are seared in all our brains. When I think of our elders in residential schools, I see in my mind those pictures of terrified Indigenous kids in dormitories. For us, shelters aren't merely grim, they trigger despair. The pandemic has made a bad homelessness problem worse. Our sense is now that the number of Indigenous people who are homeless in Regina is much bigger post the onset of COVID-19. It has been a time of risk and makes many of us think of other pandemics that have hit disproportionately hard with vulnerable Indigenous populations. Emergency services that should be available are not easily accessible to homeless people. That includes emergency crisis lines for those in trouble. Those who could be freezing outside in below zero temperatures, or now calling to book an appointment to test for COVID-19. You need a phone for all of those, something that many homeless people do not have. We've been urged to stay home and to stay safe during this pandemic, but it's difficult to isolate and keep yourself safe when you don't have a home. We see elders, mothers, and kids that COVID-19 has forced onto the streets. They were precariously housed before and have been forced to leave by anxious hosts. We certainly are not used to seeing them in such numbers, but they have nowhere to go. The places they access for food are still closed because of COVID. Donations are left outside and frequently plundered, so nothing's left. We see long lines of Indigenous elders, moms, and kids lined up at churches for dinner. For many of them, it's the only meal that day. Those elders and moms and kids, they need to wash. They get periods. They need to pee. There are fewer and fewer places to go. It's an indignity beyond words. Now, what about Namarn's tenants? Our tenants are grateful for the roof over their head, and they're still scrambling. Many of them receive social assistance, and some of them qualified for CERB. Saskatchewan claws back social assistance dollar for dollar. In that case, which could wipe out the entirety of social assistance. With that gone, the tenants no longer get help with dental, prescription drugs, and they no longer get a transit pass. So now what? Well, now you have to pay tax on CERB. Our homes are all rent geared to income, but capped at about $960 a month. Residents on social assistance who also receive CERB will only be affected up to that maximum. But what about everybody else on social assistance? Homelessness for them is $1 away. And our tenants will lose all those social assistance benefits that I just mentioned. CERB has turned out to be a nightmare for poor people. Many housing providers in Saskatchewan are concerned that once the pandemic ends and their tenants no longer receive benefits, they will be left with only debt and no job or way to pay their rent or feed their families. So what next? We have some ideas, and we are in the hunt for capital. We are optimistic that we'll be housing more people in more units soon. Namrud itself is humming with purpose. We are on a mission that we feel in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing what Namarn's been doing and what the hopes are for the future. I appreciate it. Justin, I'm going to give you screen access.
And thanks, Robert, for your last presentation there. Just bring this up. Everyone can see that screen now? Thumbs up? Okay, cool, thank you. Ani, hello. As Steve mentioned, my name is Justin Marchand. I'm Métis of Algonquin and Mi'kmaq descent. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional territory on which I live, which is that of the Ojibwe people, and more specifically that of AHMA First Nation and Garden River First Nation, as well as later on traditional homelands for many Métis people. So today, just wanted to give you a brief overview of OHS for those who aren't aware. Talk about our response to COVID-19. We've had to change our service delivery, go into a specific project that we undertook as an entire team, and what we're doing to plan on moving forward. So our mission is to provide safe and affordable housing for Indigenous people that live in urban and rural areas of Ontario. We're in our 26th year of operation. Very importantly, from a governance perspective, we're community-led, driven, and represented. We have a board that's comprised of the Métis Nation of Ontario, Ontario Native Women's Association, and the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. And that board, or that composition, really allows us to ensure that we're coordinating as best as possible our bricks and mortar housing and housing related services, along with the services that these three organizations provide right across the province. In terms of our team, we've got over 85 people working together to serve over 10,400 people every single day. And it's just that's what drives our staff, is the knowing the impact they're making in people's lives. So in terms of the response to COVID, like many of you, our operations changed quite dramatically and quickly in March of this year. We put together a response team, fairly broad across the organization. We've got about a dozen people on that, which seems like a fairly large committee, but there's just so many impacts here, and we've really found our stride very early on in terms of making sure that we're responding in the best way possible to the needs of our tenants, first and foremost, those of community members who access our services, and certainly the health and safety of our staff. Starting with the staff, since that's who delivers our services, mostly everyone, we are still working from home. Our field workers and frontline workers, home is their base, but they're out in community every single day, helping those who aren't that fortunate, which we're going to get into some of the stats on that as well to build on what Robert and Margaret provided. Keeping the staff informed through regular different types of communications and updates. Our staff are located right across Ontario as well, for those that aren't aware. About half of our staff are based in Sault Ste. Marie, and the other half are throughout the province in Dryden, Moosonee up on the James Bay coast, Sudbury, Timmins, London, Hamilton, Peterborough. We're in all corners of the province. We have our full circle meetings, which is our staff meetings. That was very important very early on to provide that open forum for Q&A and to get the information out quickly and allow people to bring forward their concerns. In terms of our tenants, we were fortunate that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing had an Indigenous set aside for their social services relief fund. It's we're always pushing for more, and we're pushing for more in terms of what we would deem a fair share. That's something that's representative of the issue. And when you have 23 to 99%, according to the PIT counts in Ontario, that are done by municipalities, when 23 to 99% of the people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous, there's something severely wrong with the system, and the responses need to change, and that structure that Margaret was referring to needs to change, both in terms of the response and as well as the underlying factors that are causing that in the first place. At a very detailed level, similar to Dave's team, we had very detailed practices put in place around PPE at our multi-unit sites for our tenants, and that's being managed by our response team as well as our local property managers and coordinators. For people accessing our Kanawee supportive housing program, Kanawee means finding their way home. Just in terms of context right now, these are federal government numbers, by the way. The feds know that people accessing shelters are 4.5 times more likely to contract COVID than the general population. And as I mentioned, in Ontario, you've got a low of 23% of the people in Hamilton experiencing homelessness being Indigenous. That percentage increases as you move further north to 99% in the far northwest of Ontario, 37% here in Sault Ste. Marie. Yet Indigenous people only represent about 3% of the total population. For those statisticians that are on the call, or I hope provincial and federal government bureaucrats, those numbers are just completely off the charts. When you have a population that's experiencing 10 times their representation of the total population, that's beyond 2 standard deviations. That's just almost impossible to measure on any sort of mathematical scale. And I use that language and those stats from the government to say and impress that this isn't opinion. This isn't how we're feeling, which is a completely different perspective. But this is the reality. These are the facts, and you can't run from that especially when it's your own facts. So now that we know what we know, it's time to do something about it. We can't claim ignorance anymore. It's certainly front and center in the media, and miigwech to the provincial, municipal, federal statisticians who track this on a bipartisan and just real factual basis. Now that we have the information, it's really time to change what we do. In terms of our field staff, they're completing weekly physical distance visits. In this sort of situation where you already have individuals who are experiencing isolation from society for systemic reasons, you throw in COVID to the mix, and it just puts individuals at that much higher of a risk for mental health issues and the like. So we've really tried very different, innovative ways of remaining connected with the people that we serve. And some of those basic services are around food and basic needs, essential supplies, things that individuals would have normally had access to when community centers were open but are now closed. Also, contractors, we've had implemented specific procedures for contractors. We have tenants who quite rightly are asking what our procedures are to keep them safe, and certainly we want to keep our contractors safe as well too. So that is all laid out in our contractual information that's tied to our purchase orders. Again, just at a very detailed level, that's some of the things that we're doing. Something else that we had been looking at doing, and before COVID had come on, was a data and service integrity project. And COVID was actually quite timely for us to carry this out. And I heard one of the other organizations had done something similar. We made a total of over 1,300 calls by all of our staff. Every single person on board, including myself, were all assigned a split share of our tenants, and we really wanted to touch base with our tenants, let them know that we're still here, try to put their mind at ease that their housing services are going to continue, and that we're here to work with them, whether it be through rent arrears or maintenance, and that we did have a plan to ensure that service continuity. I'm going to flip back a couple pages here. Yes, right here in terms of the tenants, I also want to highlight that social services relief fund from the ministry. We were fortunate in one regard that in that first round of SURF funding that we had been pushing the ministry, and we do this in all of our communications, whether it's provincial or federal, is that for Indigenous, by Indigenous philosophy. And fortunately, in this case, that is something that the ministry bought into. I think it wasn't, it didn't hurt that this was an emergency situation, and they allowed more flexibility than they normally would. But I think we've shown them that flexibility and that self-direction actually works extremely well. We allocated, and this is through a community-led proposal review committee that monitors more or less what management's using public funds for. So through that independent committee, we allocated $2.3 million for rent relief for our tenants, $200,000 for PPE. That's both for our staff and our tenants and community members. Another $200,000 for additional disinfecting and cleaning of our multi-unit properties. And then we also allocated $1.05 million to directly support Indigenous service agencies that are providing some of those on the ground homelessness services as well too. So that going back to that $2.3 million for rent relief, we actually paid very close attention to what the BC government was doing from a mainstream perspective, and we're providing rent relief of up to 50% of their monthly rent for a period of 4 months to start, and that's for anyone that's directly or severely indirectly impacted by COVID, and being able to offer that additional help when we were making our service integrity calls was obviously really welcome by our tenants. So we also have a formal written COVID risk assessment and safety plan. It's a live document. We look at it the day we finished writing it, and that was by Deneen, our Director of Policy and Programs, and her team that put that together. That the day that was completed was the day it was outdated, and so that document's going to continue to live and evolve with COVID-19. It's really been an opportunity for us to very quickly look at a lot of our practices, look at different ways of delivering, which from an operational perspective has been great. Lastly, from a policy perspective, this really is an enormous, I'm going to use positive language here, an enormous opportunity for all governments, municipal, provincial, federal, to systemically include Indigenous people who are living in urban and rural areas. The pandemic is highlighting what I think many of us on this call already know. I hope there's some new voices and new ears on this call that are listening to all of the panelists, but it's highlighting in bright yellow, bold letters, underlining the disproportionate outcomes for Indigenous people. And it's strange. You go back in history, and whether it was the classic example of smallpox or other health issues along the way, COVID-19 is another one that is disproportionately impacting Indigenous people. And our response, by our response, I'm talking about government's response, needs to be disproportionate as well. And so that's okay if you use data-driven and evidence-based decisions. That's been the mantra of governments for the past decade, that needs to happen. And now that we have the data, and like I said earlier, now that we know what we know, it's time for funding and for actions to match words and to match the data that's provided. So I hope there's some federal and provincial government ears out there from across Canada. And I thank you for listening and hearing that perspective, and thanks everyone for joining. Miigwech.
Thank you, Justin, for that final note. I think it's important to note that's what we have been fighting for a long time, and I think we'll continue to do that advocacy work to ensure that we are included at the table. Next up and last up is Andrew Harvey. Andrew, I will send you here. Oh, okay, you are good to go.
All right. Gwe, Ninda Luisi, Anle Harvey. Hello, my name is Andrew Harvey. Willalin to Steve and CHRA for inviting me on this panel, and Wilaliok, and thank you all to all the wonderful speakers we had. You guys have had lots of really powerful words there, and it's really great to be able to hear from other people's experiences across the country. In Newfoundland, so I'm here in Dahumcook, the island of Newfoundland, wherever I also want to recognize Mi'kmaq territory here, that we're the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. I also want to recognize the Inuit of Nunavut and Nunavut and the Innu people in Labrador as well too, as the original inhabitants of Labrador. And but here in Newfoundland, we had an interesting experience with COVID. As I'm sure many of you guys know, we've had very low total cases, like something like 400 maybe too. And so at the height, we only had relatively small bubbles of COVID there. And having said that, it doesn't mean it necessarily changed our experience, I guess. You know what I mean? We were shut down the same as everyone else kind of thing in March there too. So a little bit, so I'm with the First Light St. John's Friendship Center. So we operate a wide variety of community programs. We operate 15 affordable housing units. We operate a 15-bed homeless shelter. We have a childcare center. We have different social enterprises. We have a transportation program. We do work with provincial and federal corrections, both in the institutions and the communities. We have a Aboriginal Patient Navigator program, which is a partnership with the Regional Health Authority here too. And by and large, like also we were shut down there. I don't remember what the date was here, March 17th or something like that. But I just checked before the thing here too. On March 28th, we had a schedule with 8 online programs on the go for people to avail of again too. And so I think we had like all these groups were going virtual. So we had like the Baby Mother Goose program, Breathe program, which is a parenting group, men's drumming. We had yoga. We had men's group. We had our community cultural circle, we had Inuit programming, and our elders wisdom circle all took place weekly from the 28th of March, basically throughout too. And that was obviously a great way for people to be able to remain connected in such an isolating time too. And the other thing that we did as an organization, we put out a call basically, hey, does anyone need to be checked in on? Do you know someone who's out in the community who might be isolated, who wants a call or whatever? And so we ended up our cultural support team, along with some program staff support as well too. I think we did something like 107 different check-ins or contacts with community members in March, 108 in April, or 100, and basically more than 100 almost every month since that started too. And that looked like just calling in kind of a friendly voice to someone to check in on them. We also were able to get funding from Food First NL, which is a food security organization here in Second Harvest, to be able to provide food hampers and food gift cards for groceries for people too. I don't have the exact number of food hampers we gave out there, but something like probably 20 to 40 each month, I would say. And just because obviously, as we know, Indigenous people are kind of more likely to be at risk of food insecurity anyways too. So just having COVID impact people's employment and income was a huge factor on that too. So that was great for us to be able to provide that type of support too. And then even going back to when we shut down too with our shelter. So the shelter, we had 15 beds. I think basically when the whole thing started too, we basically stopped taking new admissions. And then it was about a couple of weeks, I guess, until we felt like we had to do that, until we had protocols in place. So how do we screen people? What are our procedures we have here for intake? What are our procedures for keeping people safe within the shelter, and for staff, obviously, as well, too. And so it took about a couple of weeks. I think we were down to about 2 people at one point, too, but relatively quickly, we were kind of back up to what was our new reduced capacity. So we had about 10 people at our shelter there. And we actually, in St. John's also, were kind of the site of, we had 2 kind of COVID scares, I would say, relatively early on in the process, so a lot of other shelters were kind of either not taking new people or having reduced capacity and such. And we had a couple different people who came through, and some of them on the phone said no, they're best kind, they haven't traveled or whatever too. But then once you get them in there, oh no, yeah, I was just tested for COVID at the hospital. And then we called the ambulance, and the ambulance was like, what are you doing? You were supposed to stay at the hospital. And so the impact of that too, and another case along those lines too, but someone who traveled in a province who had said no to certain questions, and then when they got there, it was different answers, I guess. The impact of that on staff and then the other residents in there is extremely difficult too, because once something like that happened, basically everyone had to self-isolate in their rooms too, which we were already on fairly tight lockdown as far as people being out anyways, but then sending staff home and telling them to self-isolate until we get results from tests and stuff like that too. So in both cases, they were negative, which was great, but just a huge impact on that too. And then even just we're a per diem shelter, so we don't get paid if we don't have people in the beds too. So that and our other social enterprises, we rent out space, we do different training programs, our daycare too. So a huge financial impact on our organization, obviously, on the different kind of social enterprises that we have that help offset all the other programs we have. Although in all of this, there's some opportunities, as people have been talking about too, like everyone thinks the government can't do anything quickly. Well, I guess we know they can do it quickly, because there's been a couple of really good examples of money just getting out the door really quickly. So we were quite lucky to get something like 102,000 or something along those lines, I think, from Reaching Home through the Indigenous Housing Stream, what I wrote down here, the COVID-19 Economic Response Plan, basically just to kind of let us, basically, we're starting up an Indigenous housing team, which as an organization, we've kind of been moving more in that direction, and we've always operated the shelter for the last 10 years or so too, but we haven't really had any more of those intensive directed supports towards Indigenous homelessness in St. John's. So we're super happy to be able to use some of this COVID money for that. And even, like I said, even though the number of cases are low too, just the context of COVID in it makes it very difficult for people to find places to live. Getting around everything's more difficult for people too. And so we're happy to be able to start that team, I guess. And then also along the lines of what some other people talked about too, here in St. John's, we've done 2 PIT counts now, homelessness point in time counts. And with something like a 7 or 8% Indigenous population in St. John's, we had 28%, I think, in the first one, and then 34% of people who were surveyed during our PIT count identified as Indigenous too. So just huge overrepresentations here too. And one thing I found in St. John's, being involved in homelessness for about a decade too, is there's targeted resources towards youth, there's targeted resources towards women escaping domestic violence, but we've never had any targeted resources towards the 34% of our homeless population is Indigenous too. And very, very few organizations, I think, know what to do or feel prepared or have staff who are trained in a way to deliver culturally appropriate services. So we're very happy to kind of be moving more into the homelessness realm there too. And even the affordable housing, that comes from a building that it's an old church that we ended up taking over a few years ago too. So we're kind of stepping more into this housing realm too, which is very exciting for all of us too. And just a couple other challenges, I guess, too, that along with COVID too, is just like the technology. Like, it's great that we're offering 8 weekly programs for people too, but we found that a lot of people who we're working with through corrections or just who have come to the shelter, they don't have a phone or the internet to be able to connect to all these lovely programs too. So we have had a few little pockets of money through End Homelessness St. John's, a couple different agencies here, where we were able to get phones that were preloaded with 3 months worth of data or whatever to be able to get people connected there too. Just people who are going to be really isolated. And but that's just a huge challenge, and people talked about this too, or alluded to it too, just the issues with CERB and people who are applying for CERB, and then they're getting cut off of either income support, and I was just on a call there too, actually. And one other kind of shining example here in Newfoundland, anyways, of collaboration, I guess, is we have I think there's possibly 3 different provincial or COVID-19 provincial vulnerable populations working groups. So I'm on the one around housing and homelessness too. And on that call, we did get some clarification that our income support program, basically they're going to try to take a case-by-case basis thing when it comes to CERB, but they're trying not to cut people off. If someone does lose their income support because of CERB, they're not supposed to lose their drug card. They're not supposed to lose their medical transportation things. Those are things that we know are going to be already are huge issues for some people. And even having said that, I've heard stories of that happening, even though the department's saying it's not supposed to. But anyways, a couple other opportunities to get to. Yeah, we've been lucky. We've gotten some money from the National Association of Friendship Centers, which have helped offset some of the huge costs, both in like purchasing PPE, purchasing cleaners, as well as offset lost revenue, which has just been quite large for some of our programs too. And we're expecting more of that money to come down to the federal government now too soon. And then the other kind of interesting point, one of our social enterprises is doing Indigenous cultural diversity training. And we have generally offered that in person. We've done a couple online trainings, which have had absolutely massive numbers. So just kind of, that's one interesting thing where we're all learning to move online a little bit more too, and just seeing some of the potential benefits of that too. And maybe that's a good delivery model for this program going forward. But so we're gonna look into that more too. But anyways, I'm gonna leave it there because we're a bit over time on it. So Maltese, I hope to see you all later in St. John's for CHRA Congress next year. And anyways, hope everyone's having a great day and making it through all this. So, well,
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today, in particular our speakers. I know Robert had to jump out, but Dave and your team, Justin, Margaret, Rod as well, and of course, Andrew. Thank you all for sharing your stories about how your organizations have navigated through the pandemic and continue to navigate the pandemic. As we all know, it's not over yet, and we are still facing a crisis. That is all for us. So again, thank you, speakers, and thank you all for tuning in. We will be sending out, this has been recorded, so everybody will have access to this after, and we will have a general caucus webinar coming up towards the end of next month. So again, thank you all and have a great day.